across 17,000 documented civilizations, spanning 42,000 inhabited worlds. One truth remained mathematically consistent. Every species could be sorted, categorized, and filed into neat little boxes labeled either things that eat or things that get eaten. According to YouTube analytics, 98% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. The Intersystem Biological Classification Authority had spent 3 centuries perfecting this system, complete with subcategories, threat assessments, and a color-coded chart that kindergartners across the galaxy used to determine which aliens they should avoid on field trips. At the very top of this carefully constructed hierarchy, printed in aggressive crimson and underlined twice, sat the Vrex. 8 feet of rippling muscle, retractable claws that could shred reinforced titanium, and a jaw structure that made evolutionary biologists weep with admiration. Their homeworld of Vrexia Prime had no prey animals anymore, mostly because the Vrex had eaten them all approximately 4,000 years ago, and then felt slightly guilty about it. These days, they imported their protein and spent their considerable free time being terrifyingly good at diplomacy, which was somehow worse than when they'd just been eating people. Nobody argued with the Vrex. Nobody cut in front of them in lines. When a Vrex delegation arrived at a spaceport, traffic controllers suddenly discovered they had premium docking spaces available, even if it meant bumping a counselor's yacht into the economy section. This wasn't prejudice. This was survival instinct functioning exactly as evolution intended. Kepler 442b was what the tourism board optimistically called an integration world, which translated from diplomatic doublespeak meant a planet where we stick species together and hope they don't restart the ancient wars. The colony had been established 50 standard years ago as a bold experiment in cohabitation. Prey species, predator species, and that awkward middle category of species who ate plants but could absolutely ruin your day if provoked, all living in theoretically harmonious proximity. The planet itself was aggressively pleasant, featuring purple-tinted skies, 3 moons that created spectacular tides, and the kind of pristine wilderness that made nature documentarians quit their jobs and move there permanently. Rivers cut through crystalline forests where bioluminescent flowers bloomed after dark, and mountains scraped at cloud cover with geological enthusiasm. Every travel brochure featured the same tagline, Kepler 442b, where tomorrow's unity begins today. Every resident knew the real slogan should have been, Kepler 442b, it's only awkward if you make it awkward. The diplomatic gathering had been scheduled for months, one of those tedious but necessary functions where various species pretended they enjoyed small talk while secretly calculating docking fees and trade agreements. The venue was Riverside Park, a stretch of manicured landscape beside the Theta River, which flowed with the kind of peaceful burbling that nature poets wrote insufferable verses about. Tables laden with species-appropriate refreshments dotted the grounds, protein cubes for carnivores, compressed vegetation discs for herbivores, and that weird crystallized nutrient paste that silicon-based life forms claimed was delicious but everyone else suspected was basically edible gravel. The human research team occupied a corner table with admirable efficiency, having learned through repeated experience that positioning themselves near exits reduced the number of concerned questions about their bizarre anatomy. Humans had joined the galactic community 47 years ago, and the galaxy still hadn't figured out what to make of them. Their classification kept getting revised. Initially filed under prey species, subcategory persistent, they'd been moved 6 times as various incidents suggested they might belong somewhere else entirely. The current designation read, prey species, special circumstances, see appendix. One particular human woman from the research team stood near the refreshment station, holding a cup of something brown that steamed gently in the afternoon air. She wore practical field clothes, reinforced pants, a jacket with too many pockets, and boots designed for actual work rather than diplomatic posturing. Her hair was pulled back functionally, and her expression suggested she'd rather be literally anywhere else, possibly including a black hole. The Vrex family had arrived precisely on time, because Vrex were never late and never early. The father, a decorated military commander named something unpronounceable that translated roughly to "sunset runs red with victory," moved with liquid grace that reminded everyone present why apex predators held that title. His mate matched his height, her silver-tipped fur indicating prestigious bloodline status. Between them bounded their cub, approximately 3 standard years old, which in Vrex development meant he possessed all the natural weapons of his species, but none of the judgment. The cub had been named in traditional fashion during a ceremony involving ceremonial drums and ritual scarification, but everyone called him by the nickname that meant Little Trouble, because even Rex's parents understood irony. He tumbled across the grass with the kind of reckless enthusiasm that transcended species barriers, chasing some floating seed pod with single-minded determination. Alien children, regardless of their position on the food chain, shared certain universal characteristics. They possessed infinite energy, negligible self-preservation instincts, and an unerring ability to find danger in even the most child-proofed environments. Little Trouble exemplified these traits with spectacular commitment. The Theta River, for all its peaceful appearance, moved with considerable force beneath its placid surface. Spring runoff from the northern mountains had swollen the current to levels that made the Park Service post warning signs in 17 languages. These signs featured helpful pictograms showing various species being swept away by rushing water, accompanied by text that essentially said, "Don't be stupid." Little Trouble, demonstrating the kind of decision-making that made parents across the galaxy develop premature gray hair, decided the floating seed pod looked even more interesting from the riverbank. He bounded toward the water's edge with predatory speed, his small claws throwing up divots of grass. What happened next occurred in that stretched-out temporality that emergency situations create, where seconds become elastic and observers process events in crystalline, slow-motion detail. The cub's trajectory, combined with his momentum and the slick moss coating the river rocks, produced an outcome that even the least mathematically inclined observer could predict. His paws hit the wet stone, friction failed to materialize, and physics enacted its will with characteristic indifference. Little Trouble tumbled into the Theta River with a splash that seemed far too small for the disaster it represented. The current seized him immediately, because rivers don't pause to check species classifications before drowning people. His small head appeared once above the surface, mouth open in a yelp of surprise, before the water pulled him under. The rapids downstream churned white around ancient boulders, creating the kind of obstacle course that killed experienced swimmers, let alone 3-year-old cubs who just discovered water was wet the hard way. The Vrex mother's scream ripped across the gathering, a sound pitched somewhere between rage and terror that made every prey species present instinctively flatten themselves against the ground. The father moved instantly, his warrior reflexes overriding parental panic, sprinting toward the riverbank with speed that shouldn't have been possible for something so large. He would be too late. Everyone could see it. The mathematics of distance, current speed, and Vrex's swimming ability produced an equation with an unacceptable answer, which was precisely when the human woman, still holding her cup of coffee, set it down carefully on the nearest table, kicked off her boots with 2 efficient movements, and dove into the river without hesitation, ceremony, or apparent thought for the fact that she was launching herself toward a drowning apex predator who possessed more natural weapons than a military arsenal. The gathered delegates, representing 47 species and approximately 6 different phyla, stood frozen in collective shock as the human woman vanished beneath the churning water. Somewhere in the Intersystem Biological Classification Authority's central database, an algorithm monitoring anomalous behavior flagged the incident for review. The file was titled, "Humans. Appendix requires further expansion." The water hit like a wall of liquid ice, because mountain runoff didn't care about dramatic rescue attempts or interspecies relations. The human woman's vision dissolved into churning bubbles and refracted sunlight as the current grabbed her with enthusiastic malice. Her first coherent thought, beyond the screaming physiological response to cold water, was that she'd made excellent life choices and definitely wouldn't regret this later. Assuming there was a later. The Theta River had opinions about where objects should go, and those opinions involved downstream at maximum velocity. She fought against the current not by opposing it directly, which would have been monumentally stupid, but by angling across it, using the water's own force to propel her toward where the cub had disappeared. Her arms cut through the rapids with strokes that looked inefficient, but somehow worked. A swimming style that made aquatic species grimace but got humans from point A to point B without drowning. On the riverbank, the diplomatic gathering had transformed into pandemonium with remarkable speed. The wreck's father reached the water's edge and dove in without breaking stride, his powerful limbs designed for pursuit, cutting through the current. His mate stood frozen, maternal instinct warring with the knowledge that 3 wrecks in the river wouldn't improve the situation, her claws extended fully and digging furrows into the ground. A Quellan delegate, whose species possessed compound eyes capable of tracking multiple objects simultaneously, provided running commentary that nobody had asked for. The human has achieved submersion. Current velocity approximately 8 meters per second. Probability of successful retrieval calculated at... Oh, that's not encouraging. Shut up, hissed a Tarvine administrator, her herbivorous instincts screaming at her to flee from the distressed predators, but her diplomatic training keeping her rooted in place. The human woman's head broke the surface 15 meters downstream, water streaming from her hair. She gasped air with the kind of desperation that suggested her species hadn't evolved gills, which made her presence in the river even more baffling. Her eyes scanned the churning water with systematic precision, looking for any flash of Rex-colored fur among the white foam. There, a small paw flailing above the surface for half a second before the current dragged it under again. She adjusted her trajectory with another powerful stroke, diving beneath the surface toward where physics and fluid dynamics suggested the cub would be. The underwater world was chaos rendered in blue-green shadows, with visibility measuring approximately terrible. Silt churned through the water column like particulate fog, and submerged rocks appeared from the murk with startling suddenness. The cub tumbled past her, spinning in the current's grip like a very small, very panicked torpedo. She lunged, her fingers grazing wet fur before the water tore him away. Her lungs began broadcasting urgent messages about oxygen requirements, but she ignored them with the kind of biological override that separated intelligent species from wisely cautious ones. Second attempt. She kicked harder, angling deeper, her hand closing around something solid. The cub's scruff, that universal handle that evolution had conveniently installed on young predators. She gripped tight enough to maintain hold, but not so tight she'd injure, operating on instincts that her species had developed hauling various infant mammals out of various stupid situations throughout their evolutionary history. The cub immediately did what any self-respecting predator would do when grabbed by an unknown entity. He panicked harder. His claws extended reflexively, scoring lines across her forearm that began leaking blood into the water with cinematic timing. Pain receptors filed complaints that her brain declined to process, too busy with the current crisis of not drowning. She kicked toward the surface, hampered by the additional weight and the cub's thrashing. Breaking into air felt like winning an argument with the universe, though the universe was already preparing its rebuttal. The rapids accelerated around a bend, channeling toward a section where boulders created a natural gauntlet that looked designed specifically to kill things. The wreck's father materialized beside her with a kind of speed that shouldn't have been possible, even for apex predators. Water streamed from his fangs as he assessed the situation with military efficiency. He reached for his cub, but the human woman was already angling them both toward the riverbank, using an overhanging branch as a target. "Rock!" she shouted, the first word she'd spoken since entering the water, because apparently near-death experiences made humans chatty. They both saw it simultaneously, a boulder the size of a transit pod lurking just beneath the surface, positioned perfectly to introduce their skulls to the concept of blunt force trauma. The wreck's father grabbed the human woman's jacket with one massive paw and pulled them sideways with strength that redefined the term forceful. They spun past the obstacle with centimeters to spare, the current shoving them toward the bank with grudging cooperation. The human woman's free hand caught the branch she'd targeted, her grip slipping on wet bark before finding purchase. The wreck's father seized it as well, and together they created an anchor point against the current's insistence that everything should continue downstream. The cub coughed water from his lungs with the kind of hacking sounds that were simultaneously adorable and concerning. Hauling themselves and the cub onto the bank required the kind of collaborative effort that diplomats would later cite as evidence of successful interspecies cooperation. The reality involved significantly more cursing in multiple languages than the official reports would mention. The human woman collapsed onto solid ground with the grateful gracelessness of someone who just convinced physics to postpone her demise. The cub sprawled beside her, coughing up what seemed like half the river while making pitiful mewing sounds. The wreck's father crouched nearby, his chest heaving with exertion, his expression cycling through approximately 17 different emotions. The wreck's mother arrived at a dead sprint, having covered 200 meters in what spectators would later argue was either a new speed record or a violation of known physics. She skidded to a stop beside her cub, her claws throwing up dirt, and made a sound halfway between a sob and a growl that needed no translation. The human woman sat up slowly, water streaming from her clothes in quantity sufficient to create a small puddle. She looked at the scratches on her forearm where the cub's claws had scored deep furrows, then at the cub himself, who had stopped coughing and was now staring at her with wide eyes that held the dawning awareness that he'd done something monumentally stupid. "Well," she said, addressing no one in particular, her voice hoarse from river water and oxygen deprivation. "That was exactly as terrible as I thought it would be." The wreck's mother's head snapped toward her, and for a moment, every prey species instinct in the gathered crowd screamed warnings about making eye contact with apex predators. The mother's lips pulled back, revealing fangs that could punch through hull plating, her eyes locked on the human woman with an intensity that made diplomatic security personnel reach for weapons they weren't supposed to have brought to a peaceful gathering. The human woman, demonstrating either remarkable courage or catastrophic stupidity, didn't look away. She simply sat there, bleeding and soaked, meeting the wreck's mother's gaze with the kind of exhausted directness that suggested she'd already survived the hard part and wasn't particularly concerned about whatever came next. The wreck's mother inhaled deeply, her nostrils flaring as she processed scents and situations. Her cub was alive, traumatized but breathing. The human woman made no move to flee or defend herself, just sat there looking like a drowned rat with questionable judgment. The father remained poised between them, his body language suggesting he was prepared to intervene, but wasn't sure which direction intervention should take. Medical teams arrived with the kind of rushed efficiency that suggested they'd been sprinting since the moment bodies started hitting water. A Thanarian medic, whose species had perfected emergency medicine through millennia of patching up various idiots who'd ignored warning signs, approached with a scanner and an expression of professional exasperation. "Don't move," the medic instructed the human woman, running the scanner across her with quick efficiency. "You've got lacerations, potential hypothermia, approximately 47 different contusions, and what I'm generously calling adventure-induced stupidity." "That last one's pre-existing," the human woman muttered, looking at her shredded forearm with the detached interest of someone whose adrenaline was wearing off and whose pain receptors were preparing strongly worded complaints. Another medic examined the cub with gentle thoroughness while his mother watched with the intensity of someone prepared to disembowel anyone who caused additional distress. The cub whimpered but submitted to the examination, occasionally glancing at the human woman as though confirming she was still there. The gathered delegates maintained careful distance, forming a perimeter that suggested they were providing respectful space, but actually reflected nobody wanting to be within striking range of distressed Vrek's parents. The Quellan delegate continued his running commentary in hushed tones, calculating survival probabilities and updating risk assessments with the dedication of someone whose species dealt with anxiety through mathematics. The human woman's research team arrived in a cluster of concerned colleagues, already wearing expressions that mixed relief with the weary frustration of people who'd had this exact conversation before. The team leader, a man who'd spent 3 decades studying xenobiology and had developed stress lines that could be carbon dated, pinched the bridge of his nose in the universal gesture of "not again." "We've talked about this," he said, his tone suggesting they'd talked about this many times. "Talked about what?" The human woman accepted a thermal blanket from a medic, wrapping it around her shoulders. "Not letting baby predators drown?" "About calculating risk before diving into planetary hazards. I calculated. Water plus child equals bad. Pretty simple math." The Vrek's father, who'd been silently processing events while dripping river water, made a sound that was part laugh and part something else entirely. "Simple math," he repeated, his accent making the words sound like they were being scraped across gravel. "You classify survival instinct as simple math." "Survival instinct would have been staying on the bank," the research team leader pointed out with admirable patience. "What she did was—" He stopped, apparently unable to find words that adequately described jumping into rapids to rescue an apex predator's offspring without any plan beyond "grab cub, don't drown." The human woman shrugged beneath her thermal blanket, looking at the small Vrek's cub who was now pressed against his mother's side, still watching her with those wide eyes. "He fell in. Someone had to get him. I was closest." This explanation, delivered with the casual tone of someone describing their lunch order, created a ripple of confused silence through the assembled crowd. Species throughout the gathering exchanged glances that required no translation, all asking the same question: what kind of prey species voluntarily endangered itself for a predator's offspring? The Intersystem Biological Classification Authority's algorithm, still monitoring the situation through remote feeds, added another flag to humanity's file. The notation simply read, "Reassessment required." Again. The Vrek's mother stood with the kind of stillness that made prey species wonder if running would help or simply trigger chase instincts. Her cub pressed against her leg, occasionally shivering despite the warm afternoon air, while medics finished their examination with nervous efficiency. The human woman remained seated on the ground, her thermal blanket draped around shoulders that had apparently decided trembling was now an acceptable activity. A medic applied antiseptic to the claw marks on her forearm with careful precision. "These will scar," the Thanarian medic observed. "Add them to the collection," the human woman replied, flexing her fingers experimentally. The Vrek's mother took 3 steps forward, closing the distance with deliberate slowness. Her mate tensed but didn't intervene. The gathered delegates held their collective breath, creating an almost comical moment of silence broken only by the river's continued indifference. When the Vrek's mother spoke, her voice carried that particular resonance that apex predators possessed. "You jumped into the river." "Yes," the human woman confirmed. "For my cub. He was drowning. Seemed relevant." The Vrek's mother's ears flicked forward. "You are prey species, classified, filed, documented as such across 17,000 civilizations." "The paperwork might be wrong," the human woman suggested with the kind of diplomatic grace that made her research team leader physically wince. "Prey species do not rescue predator offspring. This violates established patterns." The Vrek's mother's tail lashed once. "Prey species flee. Prey species prioritize self-preservation. Maybe fundamental truths need better fact-checking." The cub made a small sound, drawing his mother's attention briefly before she refocused on the human woman. "You were injured. My cub's claws marked you. You could have released him to save yourself." "Could have. Didn't want to." This answer seemed to break something in the Vrek's mother's understanding of universal order. Her claws extended and retracted twice. "Why?" Because he's 3 years old and scared, and the river didn't care what species he was. The human woman pulled the thermal blanket tighter. Besides, your mate got there pretty fast. Team effort. The diplomatic contingent exchanged glances that encompassed approximately 47 different species versions of, "What the hell are we witnessing?" The Vrek's mother lowered herself until she was at eye level with the human woman. "You understand what you have done? You have created a blood debt. My cub breathes because you risked your life. This is not forgotten among my people. You have bound our families through action that supersedes classification." The human woman blinked, processing this information while water dripped from her hair. "I really just didn't want him to drown." "Yes," the Vrek's mother said slowly. "This is what makes it significant. You acted without expectation of debt or reward. You simply acted." She straightened to her full height, then performed a gesture that made every Vrek scholar in communication range freeze in stunned recognition. She placed her right paw over her heart, extended her claws fully, and bowed her head in acknowledgement of debt that could never be fully repaid. Her mate immediately mirrored the gesture, and their cub attempted his own version with clumsy sincerity. The human woman looked at her research team leader, silently asking if she was supposed to respond somehow. He shrugged with the helpless expression of someone whose expertise didn't cover spontaneous cultural exchanges created by impulsive river rescues. "You're welcome," she offered tentatively. News traveled through the galactic network with the efficiency of gossip and the embellishment of legend. Within 6 standard hours, 42 news organizations had filed reports about the incident, each adding their own species-specific interpretation of events. The Karathi Broadcasting Network led with "Prey Species Defies Classification Through Aquatic Intervention." The Vrek's Imperial News chose the more direct "Human Saves Cub, Questions Remain." The human research team's communication console exploded with inquiries from xenobiologists, behavioral psychologists, and at least one insurance company demanding to know if intentional predator rescue fell under their coverage policy. The team leader spent 3 hours explaining that no, this wasn't standard human protocol. And yes, they'd already discussed risk assessment with the individual in question, and no, discussing it more wouldn't change anything. Various species attempted to explain the human woman's behavior through their own cultural frameworks, producing results that ranged from amusing to wildly inaccurate. The Quellan proposed she'd been suffering temporary neurological malfunction. The Tarveen suggested she'd mistaken the cub for one of her own species' young, which demonstrated fundamental misunderstanding of human visual processing. A Gentari philosopher published a 12-page treatise arguing the action proved humans were actually predators pretending to be prey, which got him laughed out of 3 academic conferences. The Vreks, characteristically direct, simply updated their cultural database with a new entry. Human species demonstrates pack-bonding behavior that transcends logical threat assessment. Recommend approach with caution and respect. Back on Kepler 442b, the diplomatic gathering had transformed into an impromptu symposium on human behavioral patterns. The human woman, now dry and wearing borrowed clothes because her original outfit had been reduced to river-damaged rags, found herself the center of attention she absolutely hadn't wanted. "But why?" a Thanarian sociologist asked for the 15th time, as though repetition would eventually produce an answer that made sense. "Because watching kids drown is bad," the human woman repeated with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to very slow learners. "Any kids, all kids, pretty universal concept where I come from. Even predator cubs who could theoretically kill you when they mature. He's 3. Right now he couldn't kill a sandwich." She rubbed her bandaged forearm absently. "Ask me again in 15 years. Maybe I'll feel differently." The Vrek's mother, who'd remained nearby with protective intensity, made a sound that might have been amusement. Her cub had finally stopped trembling and now slept against her side, exhausted by his unplanned swimming lesson. The research team leader approached with a datapad and an expression suggesting incoming bureaucracy. The Intersystem Biological Classification Authority wants to interview you. Something about revising humanity's threat assessment and behavioral predictions. Tell them I'm busy. Doing what? Not drowning. It's very time-consuming. She accepted a cup of fresh coffee from a colleague, inhaling the steam like it contained answers to questions nobody was asking correctly. They can file us wherever they want, won't change anything. And that, ultimately, was the point that the galaxy kept missing while updating classifications and revising threat matrices. Humans didn't rescue drowning cubs because some behavioral algorithm predicted they would. They did it because a child was in danger, and the equation of child plus danger equals help apparently overwrote every other consideration, including species, threat level, and personal safety. The Intersystem Biological Classification Authority eventually created a new category, used exclusively for one species. The file was titled Humanity, Predator, Prey, and apparently whatever the situation requires. In smaller text, someone had added, recommend treating with respect. They're statistically likely to save your children and deeply unlikely to care what you think about it. The classification system had spent 3 centuries sorting the galaxy into neat boxes labeled things that eat or things that get eaten. Then humans showed up and apparently decided both options were suggestions rather than rules, which was either inspiring or terrifying depending on where you fell on the food chain. The Vrek's mother watched the human woman finish her coffee with the intensity of someone still processing universal truths that had turned out to be neither universal nor particularly true. Her cub slept peacefully, alive, because a prey species had decided that classifications mattered less than action. Somewhere in the river, the current continued flowing, completely indifferent to the diplomatic incident it had caused. Water didn't care about species designations. It just flowed, impartial and eternal. Turned out humans had something in common with rivers after all. Neither particularly cared what the paperwork said they should do,